This is a train. More specifically, it's a Varney 460 painted for PRR. And this thing does not run. Usually, I'd show you what it's doing or any of that before we get to work, but there's something we actually have to do first because something else is odd about this engine, and it has to do with the wire and lack of tender. So usually, steam locomotives like this will have a tender that picks up power. This one's missing it, and usually, this wire will be long enough to actually reach down and touch a rail so you can test out the locomotive. This one, it isn't, because the wire broke because it was so brittle and worn out. I feel like this is going to break in some other places, so before we can even go and test this, we have to tear this thing apart and replace that wire. And this teardown should be pretty easy to start with, at least. I believe all I need to do is remove this front truck, and then there's a screw underneath the steam chest. I think that's what that's called. That can be removed, then we can lift the frame up, and it should just pull away. And I think the wire should be pretty easy to replace. So this should be a pretty simple start to this. I have once again changed my mind now that I'm inside the locomotive, so I think I'm just going to do all the work I need to while I have it like this. Judging by how clean it is, I really don't think there's anything to clean out in here. The bearings and everything look good, they aren't particularly sticky, these feel like they're moving pretty well, this looks completely dry and doesn't look like it's got any dried oil or anything. The only thing that really needs to be cleaned off is the commutator, so I think aside from that, all this engine needs is some fresh oil, maybe a new motor magnet, and a new wire. So I'm going to heat up my soldering iron, replace the wire, get to work on everything else, and then we'll go from there. Alright, so the wire has been removed, and it's now time for me to just give these bearings a little bit of oil. I also oiled the rods off camera already. And now I'm going to go search through my pieces of wire and see if I can just find an old one I can reuse on this thing. After some indecisiveness on my part, I found this green wire, and we're just going to use this. It probably came off a decoder or something, but for this application, it should work just fine. Alright, and that wire is now in place. So I think while the engine's like this, I'm going to test it out and see if it even works. Now, it's time to test this thing out. I've got a bunch of voltage in the track, so now I'm going to get this green wire, and I believe it needs to go on the left rail. So I will place it right there. And evidently, it is running, so that's a very good sign. Which means we just have to finish cleaning this thing up, maybe do a little bit more to it, and then it should be good to go. While I was testing this model out, I also did notice something that I want to address before we give these two pieces of the engine some fresh oil. And maybe before or after we clean out the commutator, because it's in the same part of the model, it's the magnet. So I don't know how well you can see this, but it doesn't seem to be very strong. Usually there's like a pretty strong, I don't know how to describe it, a click, sort of, when you're turning this thing over where a magnet's really strong, and this one has none of that, and it feels pretty weak, and the motor felt like it was getting a little bit warmer than it should, so I'm going to go in and replace these magnets with some new Neo ones. So, I'm now back, and the magnets have been replaced. I did, however, encounter an issue. If you see the drive shaft on the locomotive, when this thing was just running with new magnets installed, there wasn't anything to hold it back. So when the drive shaft itself was moving back and forth, the motor was contacting the back of the motor case and causing short circuits. So what I did is I just cut a little piece of styrene to go between the screw and that little shaft, whatever you want to call it, and it seems to have worked pretty well. I don't have any more issues with it short circuiting, and it seems like the magnets have made this thing good to go. So now it's time to work on this thing, give it a little bit of fresh oil, then put the whole thing back together, and then we can move on to a different part of this locomotive. Next up, the commutator needs to get cleaned. On this thing, it was pretty annoying. The one brush did not really want to fall out of place, so I couldn't easily just go in and clean out the commutator. It took a lot of effort to just try and maneuver the locomotive in a way so that I could actually clean it out. And then once I did, it was pretty easy and just like any other locomotive. And now that that's done, it's essentially just time to put the brush back on, and then it's time to oil the one little gear, the bearings on the motor, and then everything else should be good to go. Nothing else crazy went on here, aside from me forgetting to turn on my microphone, which is why I'm talking in the background right here. So now we're getting just a little bit of the grease on there with a toothpick, and then it's time to throw the shell back on, and the thing should be 100% good to go, with one key exception. So, the locomotive part of this project's done, but what's missing? And the answer to that is the tender. And I had 4 different options for these, and I have already chosen one of these, and I'll show you all 4 of these things and why I chose the one that I did. First of all, to match the locomotive, is an old die-cast PRR tender. I believe this one is an old Penline piece. I don't exactly remember where I got it from, but the chassis doesn't match. And the main reason I did not choose this one is A, the slope tender is too small, and B, there's no contacts. This locomotive needs to pick up power, so this tender will obviously not work for that. However, the rest of these will. The next one that was an option was this Vanderbilt tender, which I decided not to use purely because it does not sit very well. The front is much higher than the rear of the tender, and I don't really want to have to go in and mess with that a ton. Plus, I could use this for another project since I deal with a lot of SP steam stuff now, and this could definitely work really well with an SP steamer, so I think it's best for me to keep this one around. The next option was the C&W tender. I believe this went on probably an IHC, AHM, Mahano, something 462. I don't also remember where I got this one from, but this one does have contacts and it does match the size of the engine. However, I didn't want to use this one because the road name on the tender doesn't match the locomotive, which leaves us with one final option, this PRR tender. This one I got in a lot of, I believe it was just tenders quite some time ago, and this one was actually a pretty neat piece. This one has had a ton of work done to it. At some point there was certainly a speaker in here, it's got contacts, and this entire tender's been modified. PRR had some really lengthy tenders, which even though they're a bit big, given their history, I think that should work pretty well with this locomotive. So as you can see, this one was lengthened. When I got it, it was kind of falling apart. So I did a little bit of internal work to the shell here, and it's been reinforced and whatnot. As you can see, the chassis has also been pretty heavily upgraded, and the coal load's also been modified quite a bit. And most importantly, it has contacts. So that's something we can absolutely work with and get this thing running once again. However, I do need to sort out the wiring in here, because if we are going to use this, I want to fix this wiring mess. Now, we have my contraption pulled out, and I made a few little plans for this thing. So for the rear truck, even though it's got some, I think it's adhesive on it and whatnot, this purple wire will still work perfectly fine. However, the front truck's wire was missing, so I'm just going to make use of this little spare gray piece that I had laying around. So now it's time to strip these guys, tin them, and solder these guys together. Then we can hopefully throw the shell on, or at least over it. Actually, I don't think I need to throw on the shell. It's got a little notch right there. So we can do this with the shell unattached, which is nice. So we'll go in, strip these guys, and we'll solder these two together. Then we'll also solder the green wire to the pair and cover that with a little bit of heat shrink tube. Through the magic of working on stuff without other things in the way, I now have this gray wire soldered on, and really the only step that's left, at least for this half of the equation, is to solder these two pieces together. Now, the actual final piece of the puzzle, the little green wire right here. Now, I think all I have left to do is to heat up the heat shrink tube, and then we can test this thing out. Before I focus on making the tender look pretty, it's time to see if this thing actually runs all hooked up and put together. So I'll give it some power, and it absolutely runs, and it seems to run pretty well. And now reverse. That seems like a success to me. So now it's time to put the whole tender back together, craft up a drawbar, throw on a coupler, and maybe run a lap or two with some freight cars. Alright, to button up the tender, first of all, I'm going to use just some of this masking tape to hold some of these wires down. I don't actually have any more electrical tape yet, it's on the way, but for now I just think some of this tape should work pretty well. I've used it in the past when I've been in a pinch, and I've had basically no issues. I think one of my shays is even still completely held together with this stuff, so it served its purpose pretty well. Now that that's on there, we need to screw the tender shell in. To keep with the theme of this locomotive, I found two flatheads that should fit in there pretty well. Just because I want every single screw on here to use a flathead, I think that'll just be much easier for whoever wants to take this thing apart next. Alright, and there it is. The tender has now been held together, but there is one more important step to do before we can run this thing, and it's make a drawbar. This I'm going to do off camera because it'll be pretty annoying, because this part of the locomotive sits a lot lower than the tender. So I'll either have to modify the tender housing, or I'll have to make a weirdly shaped drawbar. We'll see exactly what I choose to do, but I'll come back once I have a completely built drawbar. So, the drawbar has been created, although I did go a little bit lazy. Instead of making something crazy custom, I just used a piece of styrene I had laying around, drilled some holes in it, and just gave it enough slack so that it could actually just hold these together without having to make any sophisticated curves, cuts, bends, shapes, anything like that. So now, all that should be left to do is to throw a new coupler on the tender. And I have a few potential options. I think I'm just going to use a standard KD coupler box though. For the coupler, I am breaking my rule of only flatheads. For most of my KD installations, I do use Phillips, so that's what I'm going to use on this thing. And just like that, the coupler is in place. Now that everything is done, it's time to see if this thing can pull a few freight cars. I know my layout is not the greatest, and I still need to redo this in the future, get a good layout in here. But I think it'll be neat to see this thing pull two vintage Varney reefers along with an old Mantua diecast caboose. So I'll give this thing some power. And I think I can call that restoration a success.